This is the Planetary Potential Podcast for those who are eager to explore entrepreneurship, innovation, and cross-cultural communication in exciting and interesting places around the world. And now, here's your host, Andrew P. Rowan.
Welcome to Episode 9 of Season 1. When do you switch from starting up to scaling up? This week, I sit down with Debbie Jaffe, Managing Director at Endeavor Peru. In our interview, we get behind the scenes of Endeavor Peru and discuss the ideal profile to become an Endeavor entrepreneur, the three major ways that Endeavor helps its entrepreneurs, and the benefits of being part of a global community like the Endeavor Network. An important reminder that opinions shared on this episode are those of individual guests. For more information, please visit www.andrewprowan.com/disclosures. Debbie and I also cover her various roles during her 10 years in the Peruvian ecosystem, family life in Peru, and the kinds of open source resources that Endeavor Peru is creating for anyone. So without further delay, let's get started. With me is Debbie Jaffe. She is the Managing Director of Endeavor Peru. We are here in Lima at Comunal, a co-working space. Debbie and I met last week during a cross-sector event, which she gave a presentation at, outlining the history of Silicon Valley. It was refreshing because it's very rare that I see someone bring into context the decades and the origin of Silicon Valley, especially in other ecosystems. So welcome, Debbie.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
So last time that we met, it was this interesting cross-sector event. Of course, Endeavor Peru was represented, Angel Ventures Peru, Swiss Contact, and it was really nice to see all these different actors kind of integrate in this style of event. I understand that Endeavor Peru occupies a unique space here in the sense that you focus on scale-ups, not startups. Can you explain a bit about what's your ideal company to help?
Well, Endeavor is a global nonprofit organization supporting high-impact entrepreneurships. We've been around for over 20 years, only 5 in Peru. We define high-impact entrepreneurs as those who have great level of income and are creating jobs. We believe that this type of entrepreneurship helps grow economies of the countries that they're in. But we also recognize that not all emerging markets have these ecosystems can support entrepreneurship like we see in Silicon Valley or New York with mentors and access to capital and other resources. We tend to focus on what we're calling the scaling stage. So if you look at early on, you have pre-incubation, incubation, acceleration. And at the scaling stage, you have companies that are already in the market for 4 or more years that have revenues north of $1 million and that have annual growth of 20% or more. We also have this distinction of not only focusing on tech companies, but also more traditional industries, as long as their business models are innovative and that they have entrepreneurs that think big and are really going to inspire others in the ecosystem to want to be entrepreneurs. We also look for an inflection point. Are they at a point in time in their growth that we can really help them with our services? And we try to focus on 3 types of services to give them access to capital, markets, and talent.
Yeah, so you've been managing director now for about 2 years, although Endeavor Peru has been active in the ecosystem for about between 5 and 6 years.
Right.
Can you talk a bit about the past 2 years? Like, what are you most proud of in terms of your accomplishments, and how has the ecosystem changed since when you first took over as managing director to today?
I'd like to go back a little bit further. When I moved to Peru, I worked at Google, and I had been obviously involved in the tech sector in Silicon Valley. And I went to one of Peru's first e-commerce days, and was a little bit disillusioned at how early the ecosystem was, especially around tech and e-commerce. Fast forward a few years when Endeavor launched, I was asked to be one of the first mentors in Endeavor. The mentors here are involved in both the selection process and in more traditional mentoring, helping companies grow. By that time, there had been a tremendous change in the ecosystem, a number of different factors. First of all, government involvement and incentives, and other organizations. There was a new law requiring or incentivizing incubators at universities
Right.
So through this combination of government incentives, universities, and private organizations, and other governments coming in, like Swiss Contact you mentioned, there's this tremendous growth and support for the particularly tech sector in the startup and entrepreneurship. So I got to see that growth. And when I was offered the opportunity to join Endeavor as the managing director, I knew it was the perfect opportunity for me to see Endeavor as a platform for both mentorship, investing, and seeing what the next thing is in the local ecosystem, but also connecting them to world markets, my connections in Silicon Valley, but also to our 30 plus offices, where a lot of our entrepreneurs in Peru, in order to grow and scale, need to move outside of Peru. It's really helping them connect to those other offices as well.
That's a great point, especially about that global network. Speaking of that global network, I know that Endeavor Vietnam was set up last year and that you had a chance to meet with some Vietnamese entrepreneurs.
No, I met with the managing director.
The managing director.
Right.
Okay. And so I expect that their focus in Endeavor Vietnam is going to be similar to the focus that you have here. Is it exactly the same, or is it tailored depending on the stage of the market?
So in terms of the industries, we are industry agnostic. We look, as I mentioned, for entrepreneurs that are going to inspire, that are coachable and willing to listen, that have an innovative business model, high potential for growth, and that are in a point in time where we can really help them with their services. But we, at least in Peru, half of our portfolio is in tech. The other half are in more traditional industries like food and beverage, retail, hospitality, even health and fitness.
Yeah.
In newer markets, it really depends on what their ecosystem stage is at. So we have offices that are just launching, like in Vietnam, and we have offices that have been around for 22 years, and each have either one person or potentially have hundreds of people, and we support each other through this global organization. So our global headquarters are in New York, and their support organization, because the entrepreneurs on the ground that we help are in emerging or what we call re-emerging markets. We have some in Europe and even cities in the US. And we have these tools, like we have a Slack channel and global meetings and offsites, and our international selection panels are a way for us to get together and share experiences. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the older offices have more experience in certain things. For example, in Peru, we developed our own version of the investor network, which they, in a later office, Chile, were replicating and asked us for help in designing this program. So in the case of Vietnam, the managing director has to look at what her goals are and what stage they are in launching their office. The first thing is putting together a board of directors that not only financially support, but are the core base of their early mentors, and then building the mentor network. And then they start their search and selection program. So they will go back over the past couple of years and say, who went through this and who can help us get to these stages? But they might find themselves with a particular challenge, whether it's funding from a global foundation. They might get help from an office in Europe, or setting up their own scale-up program, which is a feeder program into Endeavor, and they may end up coming to Latin America to ask for help. And we use our Slack channel and these live training and networking events to really help each other across the globe.
So there's this constant communication that you have with other Endeavor offices around the world?
I would say daily. So more formally through Slack, but we celebrate through WhatsApp, which, as you know, is much more the international chat application. Right. Someone has an event, they send a forward, or it's someone's birthday, or as we're at an event, communicate. But through Slack, it's very topic oriented.
And it sounds like you meet up at least once a year, all of the Endeavor managing directors for the local offices.
That's right. We have a mandatory event. It's usually about 3 days. It's usually next to another event. In the past 2 years, it's been at our Endeavor Catalyst Fund investors meeting. It was right before, and we did a VC boot camp to train all the managing directors about venture capital, not only as a service to our entrepreneurs, but to help promote our own fund, our impact investing fund. But there's always other training and events and networking and topical training around that. And what I found is, while there might be a natural pull towards other Latin American managing directors and offices, particularly in the Pacific Alliance, I tend to learn as much, if not more, than my counterparts in Asia and Europe, whose markets might be at a similar stage. Yeah. So the Egypt office might be the same size or have a similar infrastructure around their venture capital community than we have in Peru, whereas Argentina is way more advanced than we are. So I can find myself learning a lot more from the experience from Jordan or Egypt, or in some cases, Vietnam.
And so when you meet up in person and you're sharing stories, examples of what's happening in your respective ecosystems, do you find that the stories sound more similar than they are different? In the sense that the business environment, the operational conditions are more similar in a place like here in Egypt or in Vietnam, for example, than a place like here in the United States?
So I think it depends on what stage the ecosystem is at, but also which area of services. So something around venture capital, we are nothing like the United States in terms of even knowledge of the asset class, in terms of investors, but even access to that capital. We have no VC funds in Peru yet. We do have in the region, whereas I might find a lot more in common with an Asian or Middle Eastern market. But other aspects around, for example, in Latin America, the occurrence of family businesses and important business groups is much more prominent than you might find in the US, and might be similar to what you see in Asia as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. I'm wondering if these trainings, these in-person workshops and such, are they all held in New York, or is that rotated around each year?
It rotates. So this year it was in San Francisco. Last year it was in Milan during one of our international selection panels. So like I said, we always try to put it next to something where most people are going to anyway to minimize the cost. We are a nonprofit.
Right. So I'm assuming then at these international selection panels, these are the panels that have the final say on which companies and founders become Endeavor entrepreneurs, right? So as you progress through the local selection panel, eventually you make it to this final stage. And during that time is when all the offices get together, or the MDs from the offices get together and decide. Do I understand that correctly?
So it's a long process of selection for an Endeavor entrepreneur. The candidates enter in locally, and the first meeting, we call it the first opinion review, is either with a staff member or a local mentor. It's really about explaining what is Endeavor, what are their challenges, and seeing if there's a match between who we are and what we do, and who they are and what they do. And then the next step is called the second opinion review. It's actually usually 2 or 3 or 4 meetings with our local mentor network, and it has a lot more structured format, which is very similar to the panels, which is about 5 to 10 minutes of pitch, 45 minutes of question and answer, and 10 minutes of mentoring and feedback. By then, we already have put together a profile. It starts as 1 page and it ends up as a 10-page profile, getting into details about their strategy and market entry and even financials. Once they pass through the approval of our local second opinion review mentors, then they'll go to a national or local selection panel. And this is usually a half-a-day event where we'll see 2 to 3 candidates at a time, and we'll put together 2 to 3 panels of 2 of our top mentors or board members for each panel, where they'll go through this process again, but it ends in a deliberation, again, very structured and formatted. That Endeavor staff themselves don't vote or participate in this. We help organize and moderate, but it's our core of mentors and directors and expert panelists. Because if they pass the local panel, then they go on to an international panel. And these panels have seasoned venture capitalists or mentors or people of industry and growing number of Endeavor entrepreneurs that have passed this whole cycle. Again, we've been around for over 20 years. So we have entrepreneurs like from Globant in Argentina. They're a public company and they're very active on our panels. And they're also board members and board chairman in their local markets.
Yeah, so it sounds like you have this convergence of different roles that contribute to the success of Endeavor entrepreneurs. And I understand that you have more than one role here in the Peruvian ecosystem, not just as managing director of Endeavor Peru, but also as an angel investor. I'm not sure if you actively mentor teams as well outside of your role here at Endeavor?
So I started Endeavor in Peru as a mentor, not just with Endeavor, but with another accelerator called Tech Ventures. When I joined as managing director, my first question as I was in the interview process is it okay that if I'm an angel investor, because I was also investing both directly in companies and was looking at and eventually became an investor in a local seed fund. The answer I got was, it's absolutely okay as long as you're transparent and we avoid conflicts of interest. I, at that time, pulled back from being a direct mentor in companies. Of course, in my role as managing director, I indirectly mentor or give feedback or participate in some of the mentoring sessions. But I felt like it was a little unfair if I were to dedicate more time to one of our 40 entrepreneurs than another. From an investor perspective, it has been challenging. We're a very small ecosystem.
Yeah.
So it's hard not to trip over ourselves as you have a dual role of mentor, investor, and ecosystem player. So for the short term, I've done less direct investments and more participated in funds to avoid that conflict of interest. But again, the key is transparency. And as part of my job, I do need to report to my board anytime I'm involved directly or indirectly in an investment.
Going forward, do you see that challenge being more difficult, or do you see it being easier to manage as the ecosystem grows and there are more players that get involved?
It's hard to say. I think more important is establishing processes. So, for example, we had a company that went to an international selection panel and made sure very clear in asterisks to put that the managing director was an active investor. Now, less than 2% participation, but I was not involved at all in their selection process. I could not sit in. I was at the international selection panel that they went to, but I could not sit in their deliberations and hear anything about what they were talking about. And in the networking sessions, I made it very clear. So I think it's about practices around transparency and avoiding conflict of interest, even if it means missing opportunities, either on my side as an investor or on their side, avoiding conflict of interest. So I think as ecosystems get bigger, it's harder to trip over each other. But again, in Peru, we are just forming venture capitalists. There's 3. We have 1 seed fund. You tend to see the same faces. I know in your 5 weeks here in Peru, I'm sure you've seen the same people at the same events. This will naturally grow and maybe even get more specialized in some specific vertical industries.
Yeah, that's a good point. You're taking your own set of values and ethics, right? I mean, that's what you're comfortable with: disclosure, being transparent, trying to avoid conflicts of interest. Is that official policy across Endeavor offices, or is that something that you are pushing for here that is not yet formalized?
So I said at the global level, Endeavor does have a conflict of interest policy, not just for managing directors, but for any mentor panelists. As they receive their candidates that they're going to decide on, they have to proactively tell us if there's a conflict of interest. It's part of our code of ethics. For our entrepreneurs, we also give them an opportunity to see who their potential panelists are so they can do their own independent research on LinkedIn or anywhere on the internet to see if there's a potential conflict of interest. So that is something at the global level that is paramount for us, is this trust and transparency, because these entrepreneurs are really opening up their books to us to help evaluate them. And our reputation depends on it. If we really want to help these companies grow, there has to be this level of trust. At the local level in Peru, I think we're all learning as an ecosystem to put into place higher standards for privacy and confidentiality. Not only learning from our global organizations, but applying them locally to entrepreneurs, mentors, and investors that just may never have been in these situations before.
Yeah, so it's more from an educational perspective than the effort and the requirements, so that everyone is on the same page in terms of expectations and what's the right way to move forward, so that you don't end up in potentially uncomfortable situation.
Well, we do have in our memorandum of understanding for our mentors and our board members and our entrepreneurs to avoid conflict of interest, and in our contracts. But many people who are involved in scale-ups are coming from the startup world. And for some, and if I look at my own team, which we tend to have a feeder system through internships, they don't have a world of experience. So we periodically try to just discuss what may be a conflict of interest and help educate what that might be.
That's really interesting, because I think what might look as a conflict of interest from another perspective looks like an advantage, right? And I think some of that is perhaps cultural, in the sense that you can look and see, well, why wouldn't you want to take advantage of that position that you have and also get in on some of those deals, as an example. Have you experienced any of the community sort of expressing that to you? Like, why are you taking a step back? Like, we need you to be more active. You bring value add to not just the community, but to the team specifically. So in some ways, there's a kind of slowdown of the progression of the ecosystem by taking a step back?
I think it's fair to bring up the cultural aspect in terms of, conflicts of interest and what we're used to. I come from Silicon Valley where, you know, a lot of times you have people sign a non-disclosure agreement, but in some aspects of venture capital, you can't because it's just part of the business that we have to learn about these companies to be able to evaluate them. I personally tend to over-communicate to avoid the appearance of conflict of interest. But I have noticed when I joined the board of a local angel network, which has a seed fund, and when I presented it to my board as part of my contract, says I do need to present these potential conflicts of interest, or at least my involvement as a director. They all agreed that this was actually advantageous for us because it's an earlier stage than what we typically look at. And so it's deal flow.
Yeah.
I say deal flow in quotes, and podcast listeners can't see my fingers quoting, but because at that stage we don't invest, we invest at a global level much later. But we have these natural partnerships with incubators, accelerators, and angel networks to see these companies earlier stage to help identify not just the companies and their growth potentials, but who are entrepreneurs that are really inspirational. And so we all agreed that it was advantageous as an organization to have that look early on.
Yeah,
And
you're upstream basically. See,
and that's something that I share with my team. So as an investor in an angel network, I had asked the leader of this angel network, can I share your investment opportunities with my team? Because this is deal flow for us. And he said, absolutely, but please let me know. So if we end up getting an investment or helping them grow in some way, that we can link it to you. So as long as I'm transparent downstream, that I'm sharing it upstream. And we actually had a case, one of our hot candidates now, who is an entrepreneur. Both of them are Peruvian. They live abroad, but they're really linked to this ecosystem, and they have their core developer team is in Peru. We got that opportunity because I saw them in an earlier investment committee, and I asked the head of the angel network, are they ready? Are they ready? And he said, not yet. And then eventually he said, I want to make the introduction. So that came directly from our links to angel networks. So it is advantageous for all involved.
Yeah.
I think once you have money involved in investments, it just becomes a little bit more complicated.
Yeah, for sure. So today you have 40 entrepreneurs from 22 companies here in Endeavor Peru, the ecosystem. Curious, what have been some paths for scaling up outside of Peru? Of course, we're here in Latin America. I've been trying to figure out over the last few weeks, what is the default pathway into other markets, whether it's Mexico or Brazil, or even closer next door to Colombia or Chile. Could you share a bit about what you've seen among your Endeavor entrepreneurs and perhaps some of the context behind it?
So most entrepreneurs tend towards the Pacific Alliance, which is Peru, Chile, Colombia, Mexico. Those that are, sometimes there are logical reasons to expand in one to the other. They might have already a local partner established. They might see more either government policy trends that are, or cultural trends that are similar, or might already have a demand-based. And then there's the logistics. Chile and Colombia are a lot closer. It could be potentially a lot easier. Mexico is clearly the bigger market, and we do see now a lot more ambition from entrepreneurs that are going directly to Mexico because it's a bigger market. There are a lot of cultural similarities, but there are the logistics. It's further, it's bigger, and will probably be more expensive to establish themselves. And with that, one of the services that we offer is access to markets, and we're launching a program called The Road to Mexico, which is starting with a multi-page document on just really practical tips that we will make available to the entire public, and then Endeavor-specific things related to partnerships we may have with legal and accounting services, and then our mentor network, both in Mexico, but also in the region of entrepreneurs that have already gone to Mexico. That's a practical example. But having the barriers, at least of export and migration, lower in the Pacific Alliance makes that more logical, plus the Spanish language. Brazil's a tough nut to crack because it's a very big market. It's complicated to enter in from a political standpoint, and then the language is different. But it is a big market, and we are seeing entrepreneurs starting their exploration phase there. And the good thing is we have big and supportive Endeavor offices there that are supporting them in that process. A lot of them want to go to the U.S., and we can help to make that connection. And then, again, from the Spanish language, if it's an online service and they have content, they have that natural connection with Spain as well.
Interesting. Okay. So I was aware of the flow of people into Spain primarily for education. I know there's a lot of interest from Peru studying for a master's degree in Spain and Europe more broadly. I wasn't aware that there were Peruvian companies focused on entering the Spanish market.
It's not necessarily the case where they say we want to go after Spain. But if you look at one of the example companies in our portfolio is Creano, which is this edutech company with a platform that facilitates content to help educate people in the creative industries on how to deepen their skills and get this certification so that they can then earn more money because they're going a little bit deeper in, let's say, Photoshop or WordPress or tools for the creative industry. This content previously doesn't necessarily exist in Spanish. And because it's an online platform, it's available to people in Spain. And so they were seeing a natural tendency of a growing user base in Spain. That's one example where it wasn't necessarily the company saying we want to go to Spain. But if you look at the other direction, in one of the services we provide, as I mentioned, is access to markets. One of the most active Endeavor entrepreneurs in Peru is Cabify, which is an Endeavor entrepreneur based out of Spain that is, for lack of a better description, the Uber of Latin America.
Right.
And they have a distinctive value proposition. In Peru, they're known as safer and more reliable and a little bit more upscale than Uber. But they see Latin America as a really important market. And in many cases, Peru was an important hub for them. They had their marketing head was based here for a while. I don't know if that's still the case. And they see it as a market where they can experiment and do new things that they maybe haven't done in Spain.
Interesting. And would you say that's a good descriptor of the Peruvian market as a place to experiment?
I think there's certain market conditions that make it interesting, not just for Spanish companies, but we've seen this for Chilean companies as well. Lima itself is a pretty dense metropolitan area. There's a lot of traffic. Logistics are complicated, particularly if you think of the last mile on deliveries. It's a fairly informal economy with a lot of unbanked or underbanked people. So fintechs have really thrived here or continue to grow here. So if you look at things like, we have an industry vertical called Smart City. It's been pretty active in Peru. There have been last mile or taxi related companies that have opened in Peru because they see the great opportunity given the dense traffic and being able to solve problems that otherwise were difficult to solve.
So given the centralized nature of the country, can you speak a bit about some of the advantages and disadvantages of that in the Endeavor Peru context? Because it's almost like a self-selecting funnel, right? If you have entrepreneurs from around the country who want to come here to the capital, it's great for you because this is where you're based, this is where you are. But at the same time, I'm curious what it's like for other potential entrepreneurs who are interested in becoming Endeavor entrepreneurs in other parts of the country. For example, I spent 2 weeks in Piura, which is closer to Ecuador than it is to Lima. So wondering if you could share a bit about the role that centralization plays and how that impacts what kind of entrepreneurs are applying to become Endeavor entrepreneurs.
So I think even higher level, if you look at other countries in the region, Peru is a fairly centralized economy, very focused in Lima, unlike Mexico or other countries that may have 2 or 3 centers. And in fact, Endeavor does have multiple offices. At one point, we had 9 offices in Mexico. I think that's been reduced. And part of that is we see entrepreneurial networks and this ecosystem as very local. You have mentoring sessions, you have matchmaking sessions with potential investors, you have events that do require local presence. Obviously, with the internet, you can have some participation online, but the selection panels, it's a very human interaction experience. So what we've seen is, and what we require is that our entrepreneurs have at least some contact with Lima or some regular presence in Lima. We are currently working with candidates that have their 2 founders based in, one's in the US, and some are in Europe even, but they have some regularity in which they come to Peru, and they have some strong tie to Peru. They might have their development center in Arequipa or a commercial office in Lima. And so we require that link. An area that we are growing into, I mentioned the prevalence of fintech in Peru, but one area where Peru has a competitive advantage that we want to help support the ecosystem there with other players in the ecosystem is around agriculture, ag tech, and our great biodiversity.
Yeah.
you don't see biodiversity in Lima. It's in the Amazon. It's in the provinces. So one challenge we will have is how to connect with them. And we do think it's through alliances with other accelerators and incubators. But ultimately, they do have some connection to Lima in the end. And our core base of mentors and where investors will eventually come is Lima. So how do we get that connection? And we think it's through alliances.
Through alliances. And that's something that you have a lot of experience in, right? You were managing partnerships for Latin America at Google previously.
Yeah, I mean, it's a different type of alliance. So I think there's some core things that are similar is you identify what your needs are, who can meet those needs, and start almost a roadshow to see what do you need, what do they offer, and see if there's a fit. I think one of the other things that is a little different is the government support around trying to grow entrepreneurial ecosystems outside of Lima is growing, and they have a lot of resources to try to develop that. And so it really helps us identify who potential partners are because they already are in Cusco or Piura or in Arequipa. And each of them have their foci. So in Arequipa is known as a great producer of software developers. And that's something that we look at as who has their teams in Arequipa, even if they're based outside of Peru. And that's a strong enough tie for us.
I'm curious if there's any special outreach to female founders, either from the local office perspective or globally from Endeavor.
So Endeavor globally has a program called Women in High Impact Entrepreneurship. We launched that program last year, and it was a series of talks and events. This past year on the International Women's Day, we actually announced stronger initiatives to increase our participation of women in the entrepreneurial ecosystems. So, for example, in globally, women participate in startups or women-led startups have received those who have received venture funding at about a global level of 17%. Our portfolio in Endeavor in Peru is 20% women-led entrepreneurship. They could have a co-founder, but women are at least one of the founders. That's a percentage we see globally at Endeavor is about 20% of women-led entrepreneurship or startup companies or scale-up companies. Right. This year, we made a commitment to grow the number of women in our network to about 30%. So that not only includes entrepreneurs, but also mentors and directors. So we are making a concentrated effort to do that. And part of it is also just giving women a voice. So, for example, as we look at case studies or opportunities to connect with venture capitalists, just giving them that voice in our social networks and in our investor networks.
I see. I'm also curious, how are potential or aspiring Endeavor entrepreneurs aware? How do they become aware of Endeavor, of the resources that are available through the local office here? Is it at an event in person? You mentioned roadshows before. Is it online outreach?
So it's a combination. I think because we have such a footprint globally and regionally, because Endeavor first offices were in Latin America, there is some of that brand spillover into Peru. As we launched 5 years ago, in order to get our founding board members, we were aware of the brand. Over the past few years, we've really worked both through demonstrating case studies or success stories of our own entrepreneurs of spreading that brand. Although most of our services are limited to Endeavor entrepreneurs, we try to have several events open to the ecosystem during the year, mostly focused on our Endeavor Investor Network. For example, we have an event coming up this June 20th called The Road to Exit, where we want to talk to all entrepreneurs, particularly at an earlier stage, to give them advice on what they need to think about today for a potential future exit. And we're going to have investors, corporate venture folks, and other entrepreneurs that have sold mostly, and giving that advice to the entrepreneurs. And we just launched an online podcast series focusing on the voice of the entrepreneur and mentors and others on what it looks like to be an entrepreneur in Peru and in the region.
Is that in English or Spanish?
It's in Spanish. It's called Endeavor Inspire. That's the name of the podcast series, but we also have an annual event where it's a little bit more massive, where we invite all members of the ecosystem.
And if someone wants to listen to Endeavor Inspire, where can they find it?
It's on Spotify and in Apple iTunes.
Okay, super. So I hope folks will check that out.
Yeah, we've just launched our first 2 or 3. or we have a mentor talking and one of our entrepreneurs. In this case, the entrepreneur, it comes from a family business. You don't really think about family business when you think of high impact entrepreneurship, but we do look at second and even third generation family businesses that are going through either a digital transformation or the children or grandchildren of the founders are really taking the company through an important inflection point, and they're generating high amounts of income and job growth, not only in Peru, but in the region.
There are, I think, two ways you can look at family companies and groups of family-run businesses, right? One is, they're almost in a perfect position to create that generational entrepreneurial mindset, that institutional knowledge of how to scale and manage a company. The other way, I think that is perhaps more increasing on the dialogue online or globally are these family businesses or groups of family businesses sucking all the oxygen out of the room, so to speak, because they have, of course, first look at opportunities, they have the resources, and in terms of promoting inclusion in an ecosystem, there's this momentum that's directed towards existing entrepreneurs who have generational resources. Wondering if you have a comment or perspective on that.
I mean, I think when we did a study on family businesses last quarter, and we ended up dividing it into two. One of the multi-generation family businesses, which is what I mentioned. You have the second or third generation that are pivoting the company, and how can we support them? Having the multi-generation resources makes sense because natural first investor is the friends and family. And if there's a big company behind you, not only providing the financial resource, but the structural resources or the industry expertise. So if you have an interesting technology that helps in the logistics business, it helps if you have a traditional logistics business and first customer and family behind you.
Yeah.
We don't see that a ton, but it certainly makes sense. The other division that we made is these first generation family businesses, which at least in Peru, we weren't thinking were family businesses early on, but we do see a lot of startups formed by couples. So we have one case where it's this couple that were dating at university and they started this project and then they kind of secretly got married. It's several years later, but the reality is you can't avoid that is a first generation family business. You see that a lot in the food and beverage industry as well. And so what we try to do is develop the tools or the red flags of things that they need to consider before going to an international selection panel, because these are going to be the same questions or potential roadblocks that they find when they're raising funds. I've heard and met with Mexican venture capitalists that say, I will never invest in a husband and wife team. And so my goal or our goal at Endeavor is what tools can we give these teams so that when they go in front of investors like that, they can show that they've already thought about succession plans, corporate governance, professionalizing, having a professional board. And maybe they don't have everything in place today, but they're really well equipped to and have the right vocabulary and strategy sessions and mentorship that they can demonstrate that they've really thought these things through. And it should not be an issue. And you see that a lot in Latin America and also in Asia, where there's just a natural tendency for families to start businesses together. You see that in brother-sisters teams, in cousins. And they might come because they have a family business behind them, but we have to help get over that roadblock and that perception that that's a bad thing, and support those that are in that path so they can get access to these resources that otherwise may have been closed to them.
Did this Mexican investor express why exactly he or she wouldn't invest in a husband-wife team?
So when I did a deeper dive, it's more like if you're doing a mental accounting of what's in favor of them. So for example, if you look at a Peruvian company, if they're already thinking regionally or already have a foot in another country, check in favor. If they've already thought about how to develop whether it's an online product that has already thought about they can scale because they can plug into different currencies, check. They've already thought about the policy similarities or differences for something that might be in a highly regulated industry like fintech, check it for or against, depending that. And he said, if it's a family business, whether it's a brother, sister team or husband and wife team, that's a check or an X against them. So it's not a full, blackball, I would say. But, I think one of our goals would be try to get an investment with this particular VC firm. And typically they think, I've seen like the typical things around family businesses. Is it really professional? Is there nepotism? And all these, we've done double click on all these things so that these companies, again, a lot of it's establishing policies. How transparent are the policy around who gets company resources? It's as simple things as like getting a company car, which is still prevalent in Latin America. Is it transparent? Who does? Is it by the level of management that you're at? Because it wouldn't be fair if a brother or sister got a resource or a benefit just because they were a member of the family that another person who was equally qualified at a certain level didn't get. So these are little details that we've put together in a family business toolkit on that early on in the stage of a company they might not think of because they don't think of themselves as a family business because they started just dating in college. And you fast forward a few years and now you're married and maybe have a kid on the way.
And is that family business toolkit available for the general public as well, or is it specifically for your Endeavor entrepreneurs?
So right now we're in the early stages. We're using it internally, and we're looking for ways to make at least the multi-generation one available through other organizations and partnerships that deal more specifically with family businesses. And they're always interested in helping, whether it's the Lima Chamber of Commerce or the Association of Family Business. They have a lot of these resources either publicly or available to their members. And then really the multifamily business, we don't see ourselves as experts aside from what we already have in our network, and really wanting to help these first generation understand that these issues exist and help them get over that barrier of first being selected of an Endeavor entrepreneur and second, getting financing if that's a goal of theirs.
Yeah. So I'm curious, when you're doing outreach with folks in the ecosystem and you tell them that Endeavor is a not-for-profit, do you get sometimes interesting reactions from them? Because I feel even in the US, there's not much clarity. I don't think people in general fully understand what is a not-for-profit unless they've either started one or worked at one. And curious also, if people are puzzled by the not-for-profit status of Endeavor Peru.
So Endeavor, in the core of what we do, we're a not-for-profit focusing on helping for-profit companies become more profitable.
Yeah.
But we do have a sister organization, which is called Endeavor Catalyst, that has rules-based co-investment funds that can invest in Endeavor companies that are raising rounds of $5 million or more in equity. And that is a for-profit organization that actually does 50-50 profit sharing with the nonprofit. So we have these different organizations, the nonprofit and then the fund, which helps fund the nonprofit, but also provides a service to our entrepreneurs by providing up to 10% of their rounds that qualify. So it is a little bit of two hats that we wear. And I think it does allow us to access spaces and funds and go a little deeper in these economies than we would otherwise, because our motives are really to help grow the economic development of these countries through building of entrepreneurship ecosystems and helping. What we really focus is on the high impact entrepreneur and giving them the tools that they need. So some of our offices and services are self-sustaining because they have a fee, and others aren't. So some of our events we charge for, some we don't. Some come with your status as an Endeavor entrepreneur. We do ask for an annual donation from our entrepreneurs, and we do have some paid for programs or programs that are sponsored by the government. So we're really a mix of different services that we provide at different levels of donation or participation, with that main goal on growing high impact entrepreneurship and supporting the entrepreneurs in their paths.
So coming from Google, which is very much corporate world, and transitioning to the not-for-profit world here in Peru, can you talk a bit about how that was and if there were more similarities or more differences than you expected?
Well, I think I mentioned this earlier I think being in the nonprofit world is a great first job and a great last job. So I think I personally have come full circle. My first job was for a nonprofit that focused on foreign policy research. And now that I'm in a nonprofit, but it combines both the economic development component with the technology component. So coming from Google and going into Endeavor, there's actually a lot more similarities because of the natural focus on innovation and the technology industry, although we do focus on broader innovation beyond technology. But it's also been a great opportunity to apply my learnings and processes from a company that started. I would say I joined Endeavor when they were in their scale-up phase, so it was past the startup phase, and apply that to a small organization like Endeavor in Peru. But even at the global level of, a lot of the things we do globally and locally, we use objectives and key results, which are called OKRs, which is really popular at Google. And so as we're training everybody on OKRs, I'm a pro. But more importantly, the importance of setting objectives on a quarterly basis and talking to your manager on the regular basis of how are you doing, how are you getting there, how will you measure that. Being very metrics oriented is really important for us. We focus on some key impact measurements at the global and local level. One of them is job creation. So at a global level, we've helped create over 3 million jobs locally. Our entrepreneurs in 2018 create over 2,000 jobs. And revenues, so income at the global level, I think we're at $15 billion for all of our entrepreneurs, and at the local level, $133 million.
Wow.
So it's a really impactful numbers. Another number we look at locally as well as globally is in our organization, how much money did we facilitate in venture funding, either through equity or debt? And that's a really important number for us, whether or not we invested or not. And we work closely with PACOP, which is the local association of seed and venture funding, to help measure that impact that all of us have in the ecosystem. Most of the venture funding comes from outside, but we've seen that grow tremendously over the past 4 years.
So in that sense, there has been more interest externally into Peru in the last few years. Do you expect that'll only increase in the future?
So within the region, we've seen a lot of interest from Mexican and Colombian, as well as U.S.-based venture funds. For the U.S. venture funds, they may have or may not have experience investing previously in Brazil or Argentina, and that might have gone well or may not have gone well. Some are already in Mexico, and they see Peru as a great opportunity for growth in their funds. Most of them starting as regional funds, and now they feel like they've established themselves in their home countries. So last year we hosted the first VC matchmaking event. We partnered with the Lima Stock Exchange to host it there. It's a really exciting and really cool building. And we had 10 funds and 23 entrepreneurs from 6 different countries that were raising an average of $1.6 million. And we facilitated that matchmaking between the funds and the entrepreneurs. Wow. But the important part of that is not the number of funds and the number of entrepreneurs, but the number of countries represented. We had entrepreneurs come from Mexico, Chile, Colombia, the U.S. We had funds come from Costa Rica, as well as the other countries that I mentioned, that recognized that Peru was an interesting opportunity for them, whether it's in fintech or the growing opportunity in agriculture and biodiversity, where we think we have a competitive advantage.
For the firms that are coming from the U.S., do you see any potential friction points in adapting to the local culture? Or are they, as you mentioned, because they have experience elsewhere in Latin America, they're pretty well versed on how they should engage with local entrepreneurs and also local counterparts? The reason why I ask this is because we're both from New York and we both have lived in the Bay Area. And they're very different cultures in the, of course, West Coast and the East Coast. And wondering, as Americans come to another place, there's this tendency to adapt, but also your identity is American. So wondering, if you see potential challenges in that, as there is more interest from the U.S. in a place like Peru.
So I think most of the U.S.-based funds that we've seen to date are at an earlier stage where they're not going to be the Silicon Valley VC funds that we're seeing. So I think there's 2 phenomena. One is the ones that are coming to Peru. In one case, it's a Peruvian professional investor who had a private equity fund that really wants to get into the ecosystem because he sees the opportunity, but also has that cultural tie. And they come with eyes and arms open, willing to learn and adapt. Other funds that we see come from the U.S. or even other countries in Europe tend to be more vertical-based funds, whether it's for equity or debt-related funds on either social or developmental-related funds. So it's agriculture or education, and they're used to working in emerging markets. So that's not a big shock for them. While they might be new to Peru, they're not new to newer ecosystems. By the time the entrepreneurs are getting to these bigger VC funds, it's not about the funds coming to the U.S. It's about the Peruvian entrepreneurs. First of all, almost none are presenting themselves as Peruvian entrepreneurs. They are LATAM entrepreneurs. So they're and we help them with that messaging. So anytime I see in one of our profiles is we are a Peru and fill in the blank, you are LATAM, because either you're already regional or already have your regional plans. So they're already being presented as regional players by the time they're getting to the bigger funds.
That's key positioning.
And it's also important. Very rarely they're going to get to the scale that they need by being a Peruvian only company, whether I'm talking about their market offering or their teams or their base of operations or sales. So they're almost always going to be regional plays by the time they're getting to their Series A.
Got it. And so then that's one of the components that you work with the Endeavor entrepreneurs is trying to get them to think more regional or more global as opposed to thinking so local.
That's a big challenge for all of us in the ecosystem, is to get all entrepreneurs at all stages to think big from the beginning. It doesn't mean you need to launch in Mexico tomorrow, but as you're designing your product, your service, your offering, your teams, is think, how is this thing going to scale? No, it's not for everybody. There's something that might be a wonderful business. It just might not be something that's going to scale, and trying to identify those early on are important. But part of what we do is trying to make that cultural shift into thinking big. Now, sometimes they don't think big because they didn't know that they had these resources available to them regionally and globally. And they feel limited to what they've seen in the past in Peru in terms of access to certain resources. But we are seeing that shift into thinking big and thinking of their plan of expansion, regional and then potentially global expansion earlier on, even if they're not executing on it. And having that mind shift.
Now, you've been here in Peru for 10 years now,
right?
Is that correct?
I'm in my 10th year.
10th year. Well, congratulations. Wondering if it's how you expected it would be at, year 2 or year 5, or has your lifestyle today been different?
Well, I would say I mentioned early on that one of my first experiences in Peru was going to this early e-commerce day, and how disillusioned I was when I came here, how underdeveloped I felt like the tech ecosystem was and e-commerce. And that has certainly changed a lot in 10 years, both through government and private and educational sector growth. There's been a big boom in the entrepreneurial ecosystem and technological development and e-commerce in Peru. And it's been really exciting to not only watch, but participate in. And I think that we have a lot more runway to really take off and start to see our scale-ups take off. We had a couple of exits last year of companies that were bought, and we've already had at least one this year. We're also starting to see international VC investment. And so what was a slow going for the first 5 years, and even looking at venture capital and the PayCap numbers, this association of venture capital for Peru, last year we calculated just north of $9 million of investment. And just in Q1, we've calculated $6.5 million. And this doesn't count family offices and other things, so it's somewhat undercounted. So I think there's a tremendous potential and opportunity to not only watch the growth, but participate in it.
Absolutely. Wondering if you can comment a bit on family life here in Peru. Of course, my impressions, my observations are that family plays a more critical role in the lives of folks here, certainly more so than in the U.S., in how tight-knit it is, and the relationships, not just with the nuclear family, but the extended family as well. Before we started the interview, you had shared that you have children who are here in Peru. Now, of course, you're American, right? And so your children are half Peruvian, half American.
That's correct.
Or you could also say 100% Peruvian and 100% American. Curious, how you help them to better understand their identity as they grow older. And then also, I understand that when it comes to faith, religion, there's also an interesting mix as well.
Right. So my kids are Jewish Americans living in Peru. They were both born in San Francisco. We moved here when they were 6 months and 2.5 years. They both happen to be redheads, so they don't necessarily fit in with your average Peruvian profile. They go to a British school, so much of the day is in English, but most of their social life and cultural life is in Spanish. They identify as Peruvian and as well as American. We travel 2 or 3 times a year to spend significant time with my family, mostly on the East Coast.
Yeah.
when they have cousins and grandparents, et cetera. They're completely bilingual. I think early on, and particularly in the preteen years, there's a little bit of a struggle of I'm different. I'm not doing the same things as my peers are. I think they've come to identify that that's also a beautiful thing. We've managed to find a group of friends that have also mixed families in terms of faith and celebrate, at least having that cultural link to their Judaism on certain holidays. And as well as, we try to go back to the US, and I think we've actually done it without fail for 10 years, every year for Thanksgiving. And really explain to them. I've really had to take it upon myself for certain things to explain to them, like, what is Thanksgiving? And part of it is so silly. I'll show them the Charlie Brown special, so they kind of get the cultural aspect, but a little bit of the history there. Whereas we take it for granted that in the U.S. schools, they're going to just learn that stuff. On the religious front, again, trying to explain the history of where they come from. So it's been a little bit of extra work on my part of integrating both the U.S. and Jewish culture. Whereas naturally they're going to learn about Peruvian history and see their friends go through maybe their first communion. And that was a really tough time in second grade, explaining why aren't you doing that and what are you doing that's different. I can struggle with my first to explain that, and by the time my second was in second grade, she kind of understood that we don't all walk the same path, whether it's culturally or your faith or their hair color.
Right, because the majority here are Catholic and quite devout in their expressions of faith here in Latin America. So,
well, that's true in Latin America, at least in Lima. It's not present and everyday or pervasive. So I did find out quite by accident that they were doing daily prayers in their preschool, and it surprised me. But it wasn't something that they were really preaching. And so I just learned to, I think if I had lived in New York and found that out, that they went to a private school that was non-religious and they were praying every day, I think I would have been really upset. But I think you move to another country, you kind of go with the flow.
Got to adapt.
And I just sort of like, okay, what are you saying? What are you doing? And I realized, okay, well, that's just part of the culture, and really take it from a cultural angle and not a faith-based angle.
Does that mean that your children will celebrate 2 Independence Days next month?
Yes. Although my daughter's birthday is right before 4th of July. And so we've done, actually, they're both very close. We've actually done 4th of July themed birthday parties in the past. But yeah, I do feel like in Peru, while there's a lot of Independence Day celebrations, it's quite different than how we celebrate Independence Day in the U.S.
Can you elaborate? Because the Independence Day here is on July 28th.
Yeah, I mean, here it's just more cultural. Like, it's our national holidays. They don't really get into the details of what happened on those days. Whereas in the U.S., it's like there's a lot of flags and 4th of July and, everyone, it's, the barbecue and, I guess it's not that different, but here it always coincides with a big school holiday. So most people here just go out on vacation. And what we tend to do for the Peruvian Independence Day is we go to Long Beach Island, New Jersey. So, they don't really link to any festival events that are happening in Peru per se. Yeah. Whereas in the U.S., you get that time off, but it's a short weekend. So most people don't travel outside or their home area necessarily.
Yeah, really interesting to see the contrast in celebrations on a national level for Independence Day.
People still do celebrate, and there's festivals and feasts, so it's just a little different. So
great. So as we draw to a close, I would like to give you the opportunity to talk about anything I didn't ask you, whether it's about yourself or Endeavor Peru, something about Lima or the country, or if you'd like to share, for example, the best advice you've ever received. This is your time to pretty much take this platform and share what you'd like.
Great. Well, I think, for anyone of your listeners who's thinking of moving outside of their country or comfort zone, I think there's a great opportunity to take what you've learned in your life experiences and apply it elsewhere. But then also take what you're learning in your new market and apply it elsewhere. So for me, Endeavor has been a great platform. I mean, not only to do mentorship and investing and learn, but not really take this attitude, okay, I come from a smaller country, I don't have anything to contribute, but really saying, what are we good at? What do we do here? And apply it to things that you can do globally or even in the U.S. So really taking that 360-degree approach of how can you always learn something from what you're doing, but also teach in what you're learning to other markets and other colleagues that you may have if you work for an international organization.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing a bit more about the process that Endeavor uses for selection of entrepreneurs. I really enjoyed your sharing of how you've seen the ecosystem change in the 10 years that you've been here. And I think it's something to look forward to for the next 10 years and beyond. So thanks very much again. And until next time, take care.
Take care.
I appreciated Debbie's technical and tactical explanations throughout our interview. It's clear that she has a commanding overview of how the ecosystem has developed in the past 10 years and is acutely aware of the ways in which she can advance its development. Thank you for answering all my questions, Debbie. I hope you'll join me next week when we sit down with the Peru country manager of one of the leading startup accelerators in the world. If you like this episode, then please share it on social media, leave a comment, or write a review. Thank you.